Hi everybody, welcome back to Winging It. We're in week 40 and thank you for bearing with me last week while I took a little bit of a break. It was a much needed rest. We're making a quilt on a garden theme and we make roughly one block a week, and if you're new here you can catch all of the videos in this playlist at the top of the screen so that you can go back and see anything you've missed. If a quilt's not your thing, don't worry, because each of our blocks works really well as a standalone piece, so there's loads here for everyone. This week we're working on our last flower garland panel, so I'm starting with some of my mid blue fabric. It's a 20 by 20 centimetre block. And I've also got some scraps of other fabrics. I've got my blue stripe, my yellow, my pink, my red spot. I've got a couple of green fabrics that have been used elsewhere on the quilt, and I've got a little bit of my light blue there as well. We're going to be doing some applique, so I've also got my heat and seal. I've been enjoying using this recently. It's by Hemline. If you are a fan of Bondaweb, then go for it to use Bondaweb. I think I'm preferring this one at the moment. I've also got some marking tools, so I've got a heat erase pen, my aqua marker and a pencil. I've got my embroidery and paper scissors, and I've also got some threads. These are all 6-stranded cottons by Anchor. So I've got my white, which is 001, my blue, which is 130, my pink, which is 025, I've got my light green, which is 255, my dark green, which is 258, my red, which is 046, and my yellow, which is 298. I've also, just off camera, got some pins and needles and my iron and ironing pad. There is a pattern for this week. You can get this on our website. It costs £1 to download. It's just a nominal charge to help cover the cost of making these videos. I'll put the address at the bottom of the screen there, and I'll also link it in the description below. This is the first of a pair of templates for this panel, and it just gives you the layout and a bit of a guide. If you are confident sketching out your own design, then please do go for it. I have just sized and measured and given you the layout in this template. So I'm going to start in my usual way by just transferring some guidelines onto my backing fabric. So I've got my light box out. If you don't have a light box, don't worry, you can do this against the window. As long as you've got some light from behind, it will be perfectly easy to see through. And I'm going to start with my aqua pen. I'm using this because we're going to be doing some applique with our heat and seal, and I don't want to have to redraw these guidelines every time I put something onto the backing fabric. So this pen will just erase with water when I'm finished, but won't erase when it's touched with an iron. So I'm starting by putting in some dotted lines for the actual stems of the flower garland, and then when it comes to the flowers, I only really need some guides. So I'm just drawing around the very tips of each petal, and this will give me an idea of where to position my flower when I've cut it out and I'm putting it onto the background. So if you want to draw around the entire flower, that's fine, but you don't really need to. This is just some lines to help me position things. I'm going to draw around the circles, but in the end I didn't really need to because they get covered up, and I've also just marked in that seam allowance as well, just so that I know where I've got to stitch to. It did seem like you wouldn't be able to see anything, but you can see there that when I turn off my light box, the lines are perfectly visible even though they're blue on blue. So now I've got a piece of heat and seal. I've just cut a piece off to make it more manageable, and I want the paper side of the heat and seal up, and I'm just going to lay that over my template and draw around the shapes of the flowers, and I'm trying to be as careful as I can here. I want to draw the flowers and the centres separately, so at the moment I'm just going around the petals just to get that flower shape, and I'm going to mark it with a number 1 because I'm also going to mark my pattern. This will help me remember which flower is which when I'm putting them onto fabric. So I've also marked the centre as number 1 and just sketching around that circle. So now my second flower is going to be number 2, so I've just moved along, and I'm doing all of these separate because I want to be able to put them on separate fabrics. So I just want to keep each flower and each centre as a separate object. So you get the idea, just tracing those flower shapes, labelling them so I don't lose track. And now I've got all of them sketched and I want to cut them out separately. So I've got my paper scissors here because we are cutting through paper. I don't want to blunt my embroidery scissors, and I'm just going to roughly cut each flower and each centre out and just make 2 little piles. So pile of flowers, pile of centres, just so that I don't lose anything. You absolutely don't need to be fussy at this stage. We want them roughly cut out because we're going to cut them precisely once we've attached them to the fabric. I've brought in my ironing pad and I've got my 2 little heaps of flowers and centres there, and I just want to attach my heat and seal now to my fabric. So I want to be as frugal as I can. I'm just cutting off any corners so that I don't waste fabric, and I'm just going to fit that in on the wrong side of my fabric. So I want my glue side down, paper side up, the bit that we just sketched on, and I want it onto the back of my fabric. And heat and seal is slightly different to Bondaweb. With heat and seal we take our iron and we just sweep it across the surface, and that pushes out any air bubbles, and we just hold it in place for just a few seconds. Probably held it a little bit longer than I needed to there, but it doesn't hurt. So once we've attached it, it's better to let it cool. I was rushing a little bit, but we can then cut out our shape precisely. And the reason we do this is if we cut our shape out first and then attach it to the fabric, it's actually really hard then to cut precisely so that you've got glue right to the very edges of your shape. So if you do it this way around, you definitely will have glue to the very edge of each of those petals, and on a shape like this where there are pointy bits, that actually is really important. Now you can see here that I'm cutting each of the right hand sides of the petals first. I find it easier to just work the same arc all the way around and then go back and do the opposite arc. So I do all the right hand sides and then I turn my flower and do all my left hand sides. You can also see that I'm using my normal trick when we're cutting out curves or unusual shapes. It's always better to keep your scissors still and turn the fabric as you're closing the scissor blades. When you've cut your shape out, we're just going to take the back off. Sometimes you can just catch it with your nail, but if you can't, the best way of getting the paper off is to just put a tiny tear. If you just go to tear the shape, the paper will tear really quickly and the fabric won't, so that creates a little edge for you to get hold of, and you can just peel the paper off. And you can see there that glue, hopefully you can see that honeycomb texture. The glue is, I find, much more robust on this than on Bondaweb, so that's why I'm liking using it a bit more. Then I want the glue side down, and I'm just lining up the points of my petals with those markers that I put on the back of my fabric. When I've got it positioned, I'm just going to clamp my iron over the top and hold it in place for about 10 seconds. Thank you for all the concern about my injured hand, by the way. You can see it is healing really well. Hopefully it won't take a tumble at work again. So now I've got my centre for this flower. I've chosen yellow. You can do whatever you like. You can stick to a consistent pairing or you can keep it really random. I've done my others random, so I thought I'd carry on with that here. So we just repeat the process, fuse the shape to the fabric, cut it out and then take the paper off and fuse it to the backing fabric. So that's how to put your flowers on. I'm going to do the rest and then we can come back and do some embroidery. Just the 6 flowers. I'm not going to do these two, we're going to do these next week once we've joined our second block. Okay, so I've put all my flowers onto the background and I've got 2 strands of blue thread here. We're going to start adding our stitched embellishment. If I bring in our last flower garland block, we've tried to keep to a consistent colour palette, so I've put blue thread wherever I've got yellow fabric, and so that's what I'm going to do again here. I'm going to start with this yellow centre and just put a really simple running stitch around the outside, so I'm working just inside the yellow shape, and running stitch is really simple. I'm just coming up through the fabric and then back down a little way along, and I want to keep my stitches longer than the spaces between them. I think it just looks better if you do it that way. You can rock your needle when you're doing running stitch, but because we've got 3 layers of fabric and 2 layers of heat and seal, it's actually a little bit tough to get the needle through, and so if I rock it I'm likely to just have really uneven stitches and uneven spacing. So I'm doing this in 2 motions so that I get a better finish. It really is worth taking a little bit longer to do it this way. So that's me back to the start. I'm just going to finish my thread off on the back and then we can work on our flower shapes. I've got a little yellow flower down here, and again I'm going to running stitch around the outside edge. I've only got 2 layers of fabric here, so this is what I mean by rocking my needle. It's much easier to do it on this part of the design because there's not so many layers. But I'm just going to bring my needle up. I want to try and get a stitch into the point of each petal just to hold it down, and then I can just scoop a little bit of fabric and take my needle back out again in one motion. So I'm just going to go around the outside of each petal. It looks like on this small flower I'm getting 2 stitches on each side of the petal. Try not to work too close to the edge because even though we've got that glue stabilising our fabric, you are likely to shred the edges if you go too close, so just be careful when you're stitching that you leave plenty of space. So I thought we could add some more embellishment, and I'm going to put a detached chain stitch here. So I've brought my thread up, I've looped it round and gone back down in the same spot, and then I'm hooking my needle up so it comes up inside that loop, and when I pull through that creates a little teardrop shape, and then I'm going to put a little anchor stitch down into the centre of the flower. So I'll just show you that again. I've brought my needle up, looping it around and going back down the same hole, and then rocking my needle forward and pulling through inside that loop, then adding a little straight stitch down to the outside of that flower centre, and I'm going to put one of those in between each petal. All of these flowers are going to be stitched in the same way but just in slightly different colours. So little long-tailed detached chain stitch in between each petal just to finish off our flower design. That's all my blue thread. I used red thread wherever there's pink fabric, so I've got 2 strands of red now, and I'm going around all of the pink sections, putting it in my detached chain stitches. Then I used yellow thread wherever there was red fabric, so I've got 2 strands of yellow and I'm just going around my red spot. I used pink where I used the stripe fabric, and I used white thread wherever there was the pale blue. So I just put in those stitches around each of the flowers so that they all look harmonious even though the colour schemes are different. So there's my white stitching on the pale blue flower. So now I'm going to put the stem in. I've got 2 strands of my mid green and I'm going to stitch along that line in between the flowers. Now we're doing this at this point because otherwise we'd be making our flowers look really lumpy, appliquing over the top. And I'm going to do this starting with a chain stitch, so we do this in exactly the same way, but this time instead of putting on a stalk, we're going to go back in at the same point that the thread came out in that last loop and just make another loop straight away. So in goes the needle, rock it forward inside the loop, pull through, and then take the needle back down again, rock it forward inside the loop and pull through, and you just keep going along your line until you hit the flower. And then I'm going to take my needle back down. We just hop over the last chain so that the needle goes down just on the other side of the loop and pull through, and that puts in a little anchor stitch to hold it in place. And I'm actually going to finish off my thread each time because I don't want to leave a great long stitch on the back of the flower because it can get caught and damage the stitches that are on the surface. So that's me just hopping over my stitch there, and I'll just finish that off on the back. Then I'll restart on the other side of the flower and stitch along in each of the spaces, and I'll just do exactly the same on each section of stem that's visible. So when I've put those in, I've got 2 strands of my light green now, and I'm going to back stitch in between those loops. So I'm coming up in the centre of my second loop along my daisy chain, and then I'm going to go back down the centre of the first loop. Now I'm going to come up in the centre of my third loop and go back down at the centre of my second loop right next to that initial stitch. Then I come up in loop number 4 and work back to loop number 3 and carry on like that all the way along, and this puts a kind of bar in between each stitch, just adds a little bit of lightness, and I really like this stitch. I think it just looks really pretty. It just adds a little bit of something else to the stem. Each of our daisy chains has been slightly different. We did a laced back stitch on the last flower garland, and the first one was just a simple chain stitch, so they're all slightly different but have echoes of each other. So that's it. It's a really simple one this week. That's my flower garland in. I've got my flowers with our little chain stitch decorations, and I've put in my back stitch chain stitch combination for the flower garland, and next week we're going to add a second block and some more details to this. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Just readjusting my chain stitch there. I hope you've enjoyed that. I can't wait to see your versions. Do share them at hashtag FSH23quilt. Love seeing what you create. If you have enjoyed it, please do give us a like. Really appreciate it. Helps us out, helps other people find our videos as well. If you want something similar, I will link some videos over here, and if you are enjoying our content and want to see more of it, click on our logo down here. It makes it really easy for you to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great week making your flower garland, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!